Здравствуйте, everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of History with a Drywaller. Today, we are going to be continuing our covering of Vladimir Lenin with the Russian Civil War. Now, I have been dreading covering the Russian Civil War because it is, to put it mildly, a huge mess. And I know you think that I'm exaggerating when I say a huge mess. Aren't all civil wars a huge mess? And yes, they are. Civil wars are, by their very nature, very chaotic and often rather indecisive. But the Russian Civil War takes that to an extraordinary new level. Now, to get the simplest information out of the way first, the Russian Civil War lasted from November of 1917 to June of 1923. Now, it's important to keep in mind that both of those dates are highly contentious, as is a lot of the information that I'm about to unload onto you. Before we get started in earnest, however, I do want to make clear that while I'm going to be making light of the extraordinary chaos of the Russian Civil War, it was not light or fun or amusing for those who lived through it. This war, or series of wars, would result in 7 million people losing their lives, and millions of people fleeing Russia, most never to return. So while we laugh and make light of the madness and chaos of this war, and while I think we should, I do want to, at the very least, acknowledge that this was not a pleasant time for those who lived through it. Now, on to the war. So to start, who was fighting whom? Well, of course, the primary belligerents and arguably the primary antagonists of this whole monstrous mess were the Bolsheviks. They were primarily based around Petrograd and Moscow and the industrial heartland of Russia, which was based around Petrograd and Moscow. But there were also allied Bolshevik movements in Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Iran, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and many others, including Finland, as we saw from our episodes covering the history of Finland. And it should be noted that the Finnish Civil War is arguably part of this wider conflict, but we aren't going to get sidetracked down that road again. So the initial outburst of violence was an uprising against the Bolsheviks in Petrograd led by Alexander Kerensky, who, as you can recall from our last episode, was deposed by the Soviets in order to establish the Bolshevik state. This uprising was unfortunately quite quickly crushed by the Bolsheviks, but Kerensky was able to escape and make his way to the United States to live happily ever after. After this initial setback for the anti-Bolshevik forces, the White Armies would be formed. Now, the Whites were essentially just anyone who didn't like the Bolsheviks. They were a very loosely unified, and in fact, unified might even be a bit of a stretch, group of liberals, czarists, socialists, and various other anti-Bolshevik elements, and they were spread all over the Russian Empire. The two largest groups of whites was the so-called Volunteer Army, which wasn't made up of volunteers, it was just conscripts, and the Don Republic. Don as in D-O-N, not Don as in D-A-U-N. And the Don Republic was declared and supported by Russian Cossacks in the south of what had been the Russian Empire. At the same time that the White Army was forming, an uprising of left-wing socialists in Moscow would erupt and be quickly and violently repressed, and an uprising of anarchists in the Ukraine would fight both against the Reds and against the Whites, trying to establish an anarchist commune in modern Ukraine. In fact, during the violence and hatred between the socialists and the Bolsheviks, Lenin would actually be shot by a socialist in 1918. He would be shot twice, I believe once in the chest and once in the neck. He would survive, but he would never truly recover from these injuries. But setting Lenin aside, there were also be so-called green armies, which were formed out of local militias guarding groups of villages or small towns or often even individual villages to protect themselves from the whites, the reds, the anarchists, and passing brigands. To add to all this confusion and madness in Russia itself, dozens of outside powers would lend their support, usually against the Bolsheviks, and most of these would consist of actual armies and troops on the ground entering Russia. These outside powers included Japan, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, and Australia, among many, many others. And as I mentioned before, most of these armies were intent on restoring the Kerensky government and stopping communism. Adding to all this, during the last days of the First World War, Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire were, of course, actively fighting in the Russian Empire. Initially to take territory from the Bolsheviks, but eventually they were just fighting to protect what they had conquered from all these nationalist, communist, and anarchist uprisings. While all this was going on, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania worked together to defeat and drive out both foreign Soviet armies and local communist uprisings, successfully declaring independence. Poland and the Ukraine would fight both for independence from Russia and against each other, and this would all lead to Polish independence and Ukraine being split between Poland and Russia. As we mentioned before, Ukraine was also consumed by its own civil war at the time between whites, reds, and anarchists, but we aren't going to get into that. Of course, these were not the only wars for independence that took place during this time. Many other unsuccessful wars for the independence of isolated states took place in Belarus, Moldavia, Georgia, Armenia, and the Caucasus, among many, many others. And what was the final upshot of all this chaos and madness? Well, the much more united and industrialized Bolshevik army would defeat the splintered and factious white armies. The outside powers, seeing this take place, would withdraw, and the Bolsheviks would consolidate control over Russia. The left-wing socialists and the anarchists were defeated and were vigorously persecuted by the Soviets for years. The Green armies were isolated and besieged and defeated one by one by one. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland would successfully establish independent, non-Bolshevik liberal republics. Lenin would actually personally push for an invasion of Poland, which happened and was crushed at the Battle of Warsaw, or the Miracle on the Vistula, as it's called by many modern Poles. And that is your very brief and very chaotic crash course on the Russian Civil War. I wish that I could recommend to you other sources or documentaries or books like I did the Winter War in Finland, but unfortunately I have not found very accessible material covering this that isn't in just excruciating and isolated detail. So there you have it. The Russian Civil War was a crazy, violent explosion of chaos, but in the end, the Bolsheviks were able to mostly succeed in establishing a Soviet Union overtop most of the old Russian Empire. But of course, as is the case in most wars, and primarily civil wars, victory did not lead to prosperity. Toward the end of the Civil War, Lenin, disgusted with the uprisings among the socialists, he declared a ban on what he called factional activity within the party, which essentially meant that the rights of people to do things like disagree with the party leadership was even further limited. I can't imagine this repression of disagreement will come back to cause any problems once Stalin takes over. And setting aside Lenin's kicking cans down the road, the Civil War and a following drought would cause a horrendous famine to take hold in the Soviet Union in 1921. It should also be noted that the continued government requisitioning of grain that we talked about last episode did not help this situation at all. This famine would take 5 million lives on top of all the people who passed away during the Civil War, and would lead to a lot further chaos. The government ordered valuable objects to be requisitioned from all the churches and sold in order to try to raise money to fight the famine, and as you can imagine, local clergy were not happy about that, and this would lead to many violent clashes between soldiers and local clergymen and devout religious folk all over the Russian Empire. This strain, both caused by requisition and violence against the church, would result in many, many rebellions all over Russia. Not only among rural peasants, but also military garrisons like the famous Kronstadt uprising, and even urban socialists would try to rise up again to depose the Bolsheviks. Most of these, in fact all of these, would eventually be crushed, and any survivors of these uprisings would end up in the Gulag concentration camps. However, Lenin did want to try, at least, to limit the damage damage to people and to the economy. To this end, he introduced what's now known as the New Economic Policy, or NEP. This reintroduced markets, wages, investments, private markets. This is the whole deal. Like, a lot of people don't know this, but Lenin actively created capitalism in the early days of the Soviet Union. Now, unsurprisingly, this capitalist resurgence was very successful. This new model, combined with the breakup of the old Russian noble estates that took place at the beginning of the revolution, caused grain production to skyrocket past even grain levels from before the revolution, from the Tsar's time. Of course, this solution wasn't perfect, as this increase in grain would cause the price of agriculture and agricultural commodities to collapse, leading to an economic crisis that I believe is called the scissor crisis because of how it looks on graphs. Anyway, the state would intervene, fixing certain prices and nationalizing some urban factories, which would be mostly successful in stabilizing the economy and leading to greater prosperity. Now, the new economic program would last 7 years, just to jump ahead a little bit, before being canceled by Stalin, and anyone who had prospered or done marginally well under NEP would be hounded and persecuted in Stalin's purges. Now, as for Lenin, by this time in about 1922, he was seriously ill. Now, his illness seems to be mostly in problems with blood circulation, particularly in his brain, but speculation both at the time and now abounded that there was some effect of those 2 bullets that had poisoned him and this, that, and the other thing. But regardless of any of that, in May of 1922, Lenin would suffer his first stroke, leading to a temporary loss of speech and paralysis. Well, temporary for now. Unfortunately for the rest of the Soviet Union, he wasn't too sick to be an angry old villain, as he demanded the execution of the Socialist Revolutionary Party's leadership after they were accused of planning an uprising again. Also, the Bolsheviks finally, at Lenin's orders, expelled all the Mensheviks from any government positions that they still held and imprisoned all the Menshevik leadership that was brave enough to stay in the Soviet Union in concentration camps. However, none of this repression would help Lenin, as in December he suffered his second stroke. He would try to remain involved in politics, but a man who we have met briefly before was growing in power at this point beyond Lenin's control. That man was, of course, Joseph Stalin. In order to try to curb the power of Mr. Stalin, Lenin would dictate his testament, where he recommended Trotsky for leadership of the party and called for Stalin specifically to be fired from his position. Unfortunately, one of the people who could have done the most to help circulate this document was Stalin. And as we have learned before, you don't trust Joseph Stalin. Stalin, being Stalin, would successfully repress and limit the circulation of this document, making Lenin's testament have almost no effect on the political situation in the Soviet Union. In March of 1923, Lenin would then suffer a third stroke, losing his ability to speak and write, meaning that Stalin essentially had the run of the empire. And finally, cementing this position, in January of 1924, Lenin died, which would normally seem like the end of our story, or at least the end of this episode, but the circumstances surrounding Lenin's death are so fascinating and so indicative of what is to come that I'd like to cover them in brief, if I may. Stalin would organize the funeral of Lenin with the purpose of, I'm sure you can guess, showing himself as Lenin's rightful successor. To this end, Stalin would deviously and brilliantly give Trotsky the wrong date for the funeral, meaning that Trotsky was out in the Caucasus while Lenin's funeral was taking place. And as you can imagine, this no-show for Lenin's funeral would gut punch Trotsky's credibility and help lay the groundwork for his fall at the hands of Stalin. Lenin's brain, following his funeral, would be removed and dissected, allegedly to determine the nature of his genius for future generations. And I remember reading somewhere that either a picture of his brain or a scan of his brain or part of his brain, some artifact of this genius, would end up being sent into space. But now I can't for the life of me find where it is that I read that. So it's just this weird thing kicking around in the back of my head. And now it gets to kick around in the back of your head too. You're welcome. Setting Lenin's post-mortem space adventures aside, Lenin would be embalmed and put on display, and statues all across the Soviet Union would be erected in his image. In fact, you can still go go and see the Mausoleum of Lenin. It's not called that. It has a wildly over-bureaucratic Soviet name. You could go and see his body is still on display at the mausoleum. Of course, many of his statues would be pulled down and destroyed during the fall of the Soviet Union, but many of them would last until 2012, when another wave of anti-Lenin sentiment led to the destruction and the removal of some of the last of these statues in Mongolia and in the Ukraine and other peripheral areas of what used to be the Soviet Union. And with that, we close out the life and crimes of Vladimir Lenin. Thank you for joining me for this little adventure through the psychology of old Lenin. And next week, we get to cover everyone's favorite Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. I'll see you there.